FilmTalk Nigeria, we Entertainment Productions. My name is Akpan. Our FilmTalk guest today is a South African Indian, like I learned yesterday, who has become more of a Nigerian because she's been visiting, coming and going. I believe she's started Nigerian food. Yeah, she's indeed also a global citizen. She's an activist, creative artist, producer, director, educator, mediator, trainer, storyteller, writer, and a mother. You shouldn't expect any less from a woman whose mindfulness about children, human and gender rights speaks loudest wherever that filmmaking essence takes her across our world. Therefore, as a chairperson of at Children and Broadcasting Foundation for Africa, CBFA, managing director at Moments Entertainment, former title president, International Center of Films for Children and Young People, who studied art and design at the University of Johannesburg, speech and drama at Trinity College, London, and at Transvaal College of Education. She's also qualified with Masters in African Studies from Ohio University, following BA Dramatic Arts from Wits University, from Wits in South Africa. She's going to guide us through her intimate understanding of media impact for pro-social children, especially in Africa, really given her exceptional focus on nurturing the African child out of unfair media portrayal, emptied of achieving what many of us either missed or have had while we were children. A lot of things are passed, by these days when mothers probably don't know what to do with children, and society itself probably doesn't know what to do with children. So welcome to FilmTalk, Firdoze.
Bulbilia. I was explaining, if you recall yesterday, that a bulbul is a nightingale. It's a bird. A bulbul.
Okay.
A bulbilia.
Okay, that's Indian.
It's Arabic. Yeah, it's the surname is Indian. Yes.
Okay.
My first name Firdoze is Arabic, which means paradise.
Okay. So my basic issue here, or my basic understanding of what you might have to tell us today is, how should we defend human ethos for post-social childhood? Our children seem to be losing us, and we seem to be losing our children. And that comes to the fact that we have been misrepresented, given the fact that they're all telling a single story about us. Please give us a background to your latest activity at the F. Nelson Mandela Children's Festival, which happened recently.
Okay, so as the chairperson of the Children and Broadcasting Foundation for Africa, we have an Africa Charter on children's broadcasting. And Article 4, which is very important to us, says that children should hear, see, and express themselves, their languages, and their life's experiences through the electronic media that reaffirms their sense of self, community, and place. And for us, this is really important because as Africans, and in my case in particular as South Africans, we know that our language and our culture was not celebrated during apartheid. So it was very important as South Africa transitioned into a new South Africa from 1994 that we needed to change the landscape in the broadcasting sector, particularly as young people, as children, were always watching content that was very Anglophone, white, European, and did not deal with their own stories and their own folktales and their own worldview. So when we talk about losing our children in this process of what is now a global concern, because with social media, digital experiences and opportunities, we are getting even more lost in that fray of what is available for children. I think firstly, just as parents, we have a huge responsibility to our children. So if you want your cultural heritage, your storytelling, your folktales, your milieu, if you want that expressed, you need to be fundamental. You need to be foremost. You need to be the one creating those foundations for the children in your home, for whether they are your siblings or whether they are your own children. And we cannot hand that over to the schools, to the broadcasters, to the platforms, the social media platforms. It is our foremost responsibility to do that. Then, of course, as activists, we are also inclined to challenge those platforms and to say to them, you have a role and a responsibility. Because whilst you put out all of this media, you need to consider who the audience is, and you need to consider that you are not losing our children in that process. But as we know in our conversations, these are capitalist, commercial, branded content that is for a very specific reason. And the reason is not always the good reason. It's not for the reason that you and I, as people working in the sector, would like it to be. It is so people can make money. And the best way to make money is to be sensationalized, sensationalistic, to be in the shock factor, to see what is it, what creates a movement. And that is what takes us. So it's really important for us as people in the sector to take a responsibility and where possible, to use our activism to push the boundaries. That is why we started the Nelson Mandela Children's Film Festival, for example. So in 2018 was Nelson Mandela's 100th anniversary. And as the Children and Broadcasting Foundation for Africa, we have hosted many festivals along the years. We started in 1994, 95. And so it's a long history of ensuring quality media for African children. And yes, you're right when you say that I'm an Indian African or an African Indian. My ancestry is from India, but I am South African. And as you know, I am married to a Nigerian. So that is my connection with Nigeria, but also a sense of Africa, that it's really in our blood, in who we are, in how we are as human beings. So the Nelson Mandela Children's Film Festival was an important project to shine a spotlight on Tata Madiba, as we fondly call him, on the father or grandfather of the African child in a way, because as you know, he started up the Children's Fund in South Africa to make sure that a percentage of his own salary went towards the fund as a president, because he wanted to ensure that children are given the opportunities that they need, whether it was in education, in health, in all the growing up of a young person. So we took this on in 2018 and inaugurated the Nelson Mandela Children's Film Festival. This year will be the 5th year. And we do it by encouraging our partners, particularly in the global north, who have more funding available, to share with us the content that they produce. But our focus is very much on the global south, because we think that our children have a greater need because of the lack of resources. So as I walked around since 1993, just before the elections in South Africa, pushing the issue around children's rights, people would say to me, oh, no, we don't have time for children right now. We're worried about fighting the system, fighting apartheid, fighting for food security, fighting for homes, etc. And we had to say, yes, that fight is as important as the fight for children's rights. So all rights matter. You don't have human rights without children's rights and women's rights and youth rights. So this is a long journey that unfortunately we're still having to straddle. I had hoped by now, as we run into 28 years of a new South Africa, that some of these issues would have been dealt with and that our children would have had the access that they needed. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child say a child has a right to a name. In South Africa, many children, many particularly Black African children, their names were changed. Even Tata Madiba, Nelson Mandela, Nelson wasn't his name. It was a name given to him by his teacher because they couldn't pronounce his African name. Now, for us to talk about something as important as your name, which is your birthright, that is stolen from you, you can imagine the damage it does to your identity, to who you are as a person. And so part of this work is really pushing to ensure that our children have rights. A right to a name, a right to a home, a right to quality education, the right to water, all of it that is inside the Convention on the Rights of a Child. And this is really the basis of the work that we do. But we've been very lucky because we have very, very good partners. There are partners globally who work, whether it is Syndicate in Amsterdam or whether it is the George Lucas Educational Foundation in the USA. There are partners who come to the table and say, how can we assist you? What can we do? And we take that on because we think that if we have content that is produced, that is high quality, that we can share with our children, we should do that. But we should also be mindful, as you rightly say, where is our culture? Where is our tradition? Where is our language, because otherwise, and we see this in this global social media space, we are losing our identity, and our children are being swept by whatever is bigger and better in their terms because they're not exposed. So when they get an opportunity to see something that comes from the North or Western or Eurocentric, they think, oh my goodness, this is what I need because I don't have it at home. But we jostle for that power because we haven't really given our children the opportunity to be proud of who they are as African, to be proud of their language, to be proud of their culture, to sing their songs, to share their stories. And we know that it is a rich heritage. We know that Netflix and all these other platforms are looking for African stories because they have realized that they've reached saturation, they've reached the ceiling. They're needing to look to us for good stories. But also to say that, you know, as Africans, as Asians, we have very long storytelling ways. These are histories. We are on the back of other very deep, entrenched cultures. If you think of the Chinese, you know, just think of the Asian cultures. Think of the Egyptians, for example. Think of you in Nigeria. If you think of all your history and your legacy of the gods, of the ancestors, and yet we tend to look at, you know, The Hobbit or these new kind of films that are there for children, and you're kind of going, how close is this to my reality? You know, what exactly are they saying when we talk about the fantasy world? When in fact, in our African traditions, there is so much. It is so rich. So I think that's important for me. And so the Nelson Mandela Children's Film Festival shines a spotlight on Africa, on animation from Africa, storytelling from Africa. Unfortunately, we don't have enough feature films produced on the African continent for children. And even with you in Nollywood, where your legacy has grown so remarkably, there is no focus on children's content. And I've had these discussions with Nollywood producers, with filmmakers, saying, you know, if you are spending that time, energy, money, resource, start telling children's stories. Because that is really where we will change the paradigm. We will shift it. We will get young Africans to believe in their own stories. If you look at what Nollywood is doing, and some people can, you know, they can glorify it or they can diss it and say, oh, it's always about voodoo and it's about ancestors and it's, you know, but those are our histories. Those are our stories. We need to be proud of it, and we need to be able to put it. If you think about any of these global iconic productions, they talk about ancestry, they talk about fantasy, they're going into another realm. We have those within where we come from. We need to be able to bring that home, that in, and allow our children to celebrate it and to be proud of it. So if I move from there into, then you've asked me about the F show. The F show is really my name, Firdoze, but I like the ring on it because it could mean so many other things when you say the F show. And normally at the end of the show, I ask my guests to tell me what F means to them. I always say it means freedom, you know, freedom to me. As the aging activist, I will be 60 years this July. So it's always the activism which you had hoped at some point, you know, you'd be able to relax somewhere and say, you know, the work has been done. It hasn't, unfortunately. Usually I would fly 2 weeks out of a month. I'm in another country. And when COVID happened, everything shut down. And I thought the best way to do something is to go online and invite these people whom I would normally see globally in their hometowns. I would bring into the small screen, and we would have discussions on important issues. So they went from kind of starting on the 16th of June, which is in South Africa, youth, we say the whole month of June is Youth Month. In Africa, 16th of June is the Day of the African Child. And that was because of June 16th in South Africa when the uprisings happened. But now, as part of the transition in South Africa and part of building what we called a Rainbow Nation, we called it Youth Month. In a way, it's sanitized the activism of what June 16th was about, but it also enabled other youth and other communities to be part of that process. So I started the F show on the 16th of June to shine a spotlight on June 16th. And so started off kind of with a lot of discussions that were political, But they moved, into arts and culture, into the creative space, into business, into legal. So it was just bringing people in. And I tried as much as possible to make it a global conversation so that I had all the continents. So it was Africa, Asia, Latin America, Europe, the USA, as much as possible, gender, ensure a kind of gender balance and also an age balance so that we are listening to younger people talking about important issues too. It did really well. We went through 6 months kind of back to back, having 5 to 6 guests every week. And then eventually I'm doing now my PhD through the University of Johannesburg. And it's a focus on, in fact, my activism from the 1980s, a focus on the women, kind of the unsung heroes from my community. And that has taken some of my time. So the F show, we now do not do it weekly, but do it as events and issues come up, and then we just kind of curate a show.
That is so exhausting. It's like you said everything I wanted to ask you, but I need to be particular. You imagine a scenario when we were, with maybe call it ancient scenario or maybe pre-colonial scenario, or post-colonial scenario, immediate post-colonial scenario, where you had elders, whether they were women or men, gathering children around moonlit folk-telling sessions, and children learned from those and knew who they were and what they're expected to do as in accountability, all that, Do you think we've lost it completely, given the fact that cinema, as it is being presented to us, has left that realm of folk-telling and cultural accountability? Do you think we've lost it all? And to second question in that will be, who do you think is most responsible for instilling that Africanity in the child? Is it the elder, who might be female or male? Is it the mother or the father? Consider the fact that we always hear mother tongue.
So thank you. I think that the issue around whether we've lost, the folktale comes, I think, with our identity. And if we consider, I think sometimes when we talk about media for children or we talk about storytelling, we talk about it very much in an urban setting. We forget that most of Africa is still rural and that children still go to rural communities in rural schools and live in those communities. The kind of sitting under the tree and having conversations are still happening. We may not see it because we are so far removed from those realities and there are no cameras. Nobody's going into a rural community and filming what is happening. So we assume from our lens that this is what is happening. So I think there are two parts to that. There is the part that I am sure many of these storytelling activities are still taking place within rural communities. And then there is the part where we live in urban societies and our children have gadgets and social media and digital opportunities right at their fingertips. And therefore they seem to be having a different worldview, a different experience. So if we are losing it, it is again for us as the activists, as the parents, as the community leaders, as the broadcasters, as the storytellers, it is our responsibility to make sure that it is still embedded in the culture, in the way in which we do things. I will just give you a highlight right now. My husband's father of 103 years just passed away in Nigeria. So I was in Nigeria very briefly, and Faith has stayed on to help to arrange for the burial. Now, I am Muslim. We bury within a day. That is my culture. So for me to see this long procession, this long process of negotiation, of going to the church, of talking to the elders, of meeting with the village, of deciding when the date of the funeral will take place is quite a kind of challenge to who I am. And this is not so much just about being Indian or South African, but it also is about my religious views. I think in many ways we get affected by all of these things that intersect, So you Indian, you South African, you Muslim, you female, you're an activist, you're not a traditionalist, you fight in a system. So all of this comes, tumbling down. It's good for me because I can discuss this with Faith, my husband, because he's so open-minded, because he's a man of the world. And I can say to him, but where are the women? Why are you as men running around, arranging all of this? Are the women involved? Why is it so prolonged? What about the costs implications? And we had produced in 2000 a series for UNICEF on harmful traditional practices. And when it said harmful, it was violence against children. It was female genital mutilation. It was about the girl child, being pulled into marriage, marriage by abduction. It was child soldiers. So when I look at all of that and we call them harmful traditional practices, I'm questioning whether some of these traditions that we have to continue, if they are also not harmful in the way that it expects the woman to have certain roles. It expects the male to have other roles. It impacts on your livelihood. It impacts on the costs, timing. Now, when you sit there, you say, okay, how much of this tradition and culture is valuable? And I need to celebrate, and I need to make sure it remains pure. And how much of it do we adapt? And I think when I think about this, because it's all happening right now, it's also impacting on me as a storyteller, me as a parent, me as an activist. And it's jarring, because I think it's easy in isolation. As you said earlier, Adichie talks about the single story. It is not a single story. It is a complicated, complex story because of who we are as individuals. So even when you have children in that process of trying to say, this is a Nigerian culture, it is African, but it is Nigerian, but it is Southern Nigerian, not Northern Nigerian. It is Christian, not Muslim. So you begin to see how we are not the one story.
Layers. I want to recall Homi Baba, a cultural theorist, who says that's what he calls the third place of culture, where all cultures come and they struggle to override other identities. Before I go on, I'm still talking to Chairperson at Children and Broadcasting Foundation for Africa, Managing Director of Women's Entertainment South Africa, an activist, creative artist, producer, director, educator, mediator, trainer, storyteller, writer, and mother, Firdoze Bulbilia. Thank you, ma'am. I mean, this is very rich. So I was saying, Baba said there's a place he calls the third place of culture, where all cultures come together. Muted this theory regarding colonialism and struggle against colonialism. So colonialism, evolved with educated, intelligentsia, middle class Africans. And these Africans, in trying to tell the Africans, in trying to struggle in that space to have their identity, more or less happen to even use Anglo-American meters or metrics to tell their story. And so it is a constant struggle, for culture to evolve. Which one is up, which should be at the top. So now, this is what is happening in Nigeria, for example. You talk about Nollywood. We are struggling to whether be Americans, or whether be Britons, or whether be Nigerians. We don't even know what is happening to us. So what pro-social memories have you returned as a person, despite all your travels around the world, since childhood into adulthood, that you could say, if you were in that space, you would insist, this is my identity, this is who I am?
Wow, that is quite a question, because I think that it is the influence from everywhere that eventually makes your identity. But for me, as an activist, and I think that is the one through line for me. I was a student activist. I fought apartheid. I went to prison. I spent time in jail. Yes. So I, as I was in solitary confinement in jail, and the prison was called John Vorster Square, which is Johannesburg prison. It's the same prison where Steve Biko died, from the 10th floor, where Ahmed Timol died from there. So it was a notorious space. It was a scary space. We were activists, and we believed that we needed to change the the political situation, the scenario around education for us as young Africans in South Africa. And so that is my through line. When I come to Nigeria or I go to the US or I go to Europe, that is my line. I talk about being an African in that context as a political African. The traditional African, I think, sometimes gets a little bit muddled, because what is my tradition? I'm Indian, my ancestry is Indian. I do not speak an Indian language. And when my dad used to try to speak to us, we used to close our ears, which was really very silly, because we should have learned the language. My mother is...
Sorry to cut in. It is happening now in Nigeria. Even parents are the ones doing it. You hear Nigerian parents sound like, my child doesn't speak vernacular. My child speaks English. It's terrible. I'm from Akwa in the South. I went to a friend's house and I heard the daughter speaking English very fluently, very sweet. And the father was talking about a particular species, yam species. And I asked the daughter, have you eaten that yam species before? She said, no, we don't eat that sort of thing in our home. So now, sorry, I don't know, connecting your childhood, therefore, and you refusing to listen to your father speaking your language. How is it now going for you?
I want to say that in the South African context, my understanding at the time, and it was probably not very well articulated, was I felt I was an African child in South Africa, but I do not speak an African language either. So it's not that I was closing my ears to listen to Zulu. I was closing my ears, but I was only listening to English and Afrikaans. So that for me is a travesty. And it's exactly what you're saying about this daughter who says, we don't do this in this house. When we had our housekeeper and, her children grew up in our home and went to the same schools as my own daughter, I would say to her, speak in mother tongue, which is what you said earlier. And I said, and she'd get really upset with me and say, no, they must learn good English. And I'd say, I will speak English, but you will speak Sotho. They will get both languages proficiently, because that's the thing about language. If there are two parents with two different linguistics, different languages, each parent should speak their language, not a broken bit of each other's language, because the child will learn that one language from that parent and they will become fluent in that language. These are also basics that we are not taught. We don't understand it. But the richness of South African culture is that most Black African children and now younger people and older people speak several languages because they grew up together, whether there was Zulu being spoken or Sotho, depending on which region of South Africa. They are fluent in those languages as well as, because they were forced to, in English and Afrikaans. So there's a richness in language. And when you ask, how do I feel? I feel really bad that I was not at the time educated enough to say, actually, I should be listening to all these languages. Language is important. The problem in South Africa is also that after we transitioned from 94 into the new South Africa, we said we have 11 official languages, but actually we pushed English, not even Afrikaans. We pushed English and people began to say it's an international language. If you want to travel, you need it. If you want to work somewhere else. But what is the reality really? People work and live in the same country. They don't necessarily, there's a percentage of people who travel or who move to another country. Everybody's right here. So had they pushed like they did in East Africa, where Kiswahili became the lingua franca, that would have been fantastic in South Africa. We should have pushed for local indigenous language. I like when people talk about vernacular, because that's how we were brought up, talk about, oh, we don't speak vernac. And my partner Faith always laughs and said, what is vernac? How do you think about even the concept of how you sterilize in a way your rich language and you push it to the side and say, oh, no, that's not what we speak.
Yeah, as it is, young people are clothed in a collage of cultures that seem to, limit their definition of their identities. But in the Southwest, where your husband comes from, they are very conscious Sometimes when I want to switch off from bad news on CNN or BBC, I just decide to watch Yoruba movies. You know why? Because they never forget their spirituality. But then, even at that, other regions in Nigeria seem to be lost in that collage of culture where your identity is not very prominent, as I said, according to Omi Baba, who calls it the third place of culture. So, in these laws, in these identity laws, in this illusion of I'm a global citizen, what kind of real, I know you said it would be it's a collage, we're all lost, but what would you recommend for the young generation, for them to wear that culture, just like the Yorubas are doing? You hear their music, the Yoruba music has really influenced what they call Afrobeats now, which is global now. So in that case, if you were to regard me as a young person, what would you clothe me with for people out there to see me as an African?
I think it's at home. It starts at home. What is the home language? What is the home culture? What is the home tradition? What is the home religion? But if in the case where you say your friend's daughter is not interested in that, and those adults are also not interested in that, because the child learns what they see. They experience what they see.
Yes.
The beginning of your experience is at your home. Whether your home is in a palace or your home is in a hut, that is your home and that is your palace, because that's all you know. And it's what you identify with and what you believe in. They don't think, oh, that color is bad, or that place is ugly, or this is smelly. They don't know that until you, as the adult, infuses it. So if you were to ask me, I would say that we need to celebrate first our own. And when we are comfortable with it, we are open to other. We spoke about, and I digress a little, just yesterday, because it's Ramadan and we are fasting. And I was saying to somebody, I always traveled and it didn't matter to me. I would never say to people, oh, no, I'm fasting, or, oh, no, it's halal. I just went with the flow. I was fasting. And I would just eat bread. I didn't need to eat the meat if I wasn't sure, if it's not halal. Somehow, after 9/11 and the whole Islamophobia, suddenly I was saying to people, sorry, excuse me, I'm halal, or excuse me, I'm fasting. Suddenly I thought it was necessary to stamp my mark, because I felt threatened in a way by being taken over by something that was a phobia. Oh, these Muslims, move away from them. So you begin to say, I need to tell you who I am. Somehow though, in the social media space, we tending to say, no, don't identify me. I'm a global citizen. What does it mean to be a global citizen? You have to come from a source. Where's your source? What is your source? And you need to really drink. I mean, we talk about that. You drink from your source. You get filled up by your source. You are saying you go back to your Yoruba movies. It gives you your source. It reminds you of the beauty, the sounds, the textures, the tastes. It takes you back home. So when we talk about going home, what is home? Home is my identity. Home is where I am. Home is where I belong. And then I can embrace and I can bring and I can share and I can go out. So I would say that we have a responsibility to the young people to feel at home, to feel what home means, to be able to smell it, to taste it, to wear it, to really drink from that source. And thereafter, yes, we need, you don't want people to be insular. You don't want them to be stuck in a corner. You don't want them not to experience the world. And that's when you have all this other content that you share. But if you look at, for example, African American culture, and you think of that kind of hip hop culture in particular, where they were fighting a system for whatever reason. But the kind of nuances that came out of it, the language that came with it, the dressing that came with it, that a lot of African kids were aspiring to. So when I would go into a training with journalists, my first thing would be to them is, give me one word that describes Africa. And they'd say things like poverty, starvation, disease. And you'd say, guys, this is a rich continent. Where are the minerals, the volcanoes, the forests, the beauty, so the media, whatever that is, had already defined our continent. So hip hop music, in a way, defined a particular era of storytelling, which our children kind of jumped onto. And then when you said to them, give me a name of a musician, the musicians were from the US. The musicians were not from Africa or from home. They don't even know anybody from home. So what I think that is happening in Nollywood and in the Nigeria, just having returned a few days ago, is the explosion of the Nigerian culture. And whilst you say that it's being taken over by the European, the Western, the US, the UK, it is still a very strong culture that you have to protect. Because even our children who have moved to the UK or the US to study have been influenced. And they will come back home and they will try to influence what is at home, which is good. It's not a bad thing, but it's how much do you allow of that? And how much do you lose? And when you are young and you're a rebel and you are pushing, and you are saying this is old and I don't want this and doesn't work. I think when we open up to conversation and dialogue, even those young rebels will realize that this is home. This is who I am. This is what I have. And then I express myself in a way that when you talk about a collage or a mix or you're curating, it's really curating. If you look at me today and the screen I have, I'm curating myself in the space. I'm wearing, an Egyptian headgear. This is Egyptian. People don't know what this is. And I have a Palestinian scarf. I have at the back Zanzibari artwork. I've got for sure Africa, which is actually from Tanzania when you look at the mountain of Kilimanjaro, but you see the animals and you see, pictures of myself and my daughter, India and Africa. You curate your space. It's the mise en scène. When you make a film, you talk about what is in the scene. How much of that do you want to see? And I think that is what you want to say to our children, to the young people. How do you curate who you are? Some people might say this is too much. Some people might say, there's, my daughter says it to me often, she's a lawyer, and lawyers see things in a different way. Things are sometimes more black and white than they are bold and colorful. But as creatives and as artists, as storytellers, we choose from these different cultures of who we are. And this is who we make. This is how we make ourselves.
I'm still talking to a prisoner of conscience. I'm so sure that she went to prison. Moving on. It's an interesting conversation here. But the point here is now, I'll tell you from a personal perspective, I'm doing a movie story called Okanube. Okanube is supposed to be a deity belonging to the Oka people in Anambra, southeast Nigeria. Now, somebody's just said, come on with a magical child, boy who does wonders, and I'm asking myself, do I behave like Sesame Street? Do I tell a Sesame Street story? I said no. So I took it back. Fortunately for me, the guy is an Igbo. So I took it back to his homeland in Igbo. I started examining deities, origins, and I was able to enclose this boy in the dress of the deity. So he's able to do wonders. But then I also remember that there is Ozo title in Igbo land. Ozo is very, very important. It's like a title for the royalty. So for you to be an Ozo, you must have certain values. You must have integrity. You must be honest and all that. I said, so my point here is, in a way, I have come up with a personality that is subsumed in a modern situation that is supposed to resolve a conflict between his father, who's an activist, and a government official who stole money. And the father is insisting, you must account for this money. And the little boy said, look, this is not how we did it in the ancient times. You don't come out and rattle about somebody's sin, try to discuss the person on social media. There's a way we resolve African conflicts. You've seen many times in our movies where we tell stories, and it's so much like it was nice or West Nile stories, whereas we're trying to tell African stories. Now, how can we find a balance like that so that we can tell our genuine stories, even though we are subsuming it in a modern setting, or maybe we're taking a modern setting and subsuming in an ancient setting? How do we find that balance so that in the long run we can build on projects, build on intellectual property? As far as I'm concerned, we're not telling the Nigerian story yet until we're able to marry that essence and present our identity, find a balance. So in your own opinion, how do we find that balance?
I think it's difficult. I think it's a give and take, and I think it will depend on how much of the one involves the other. So I think co-production is a good way. You bring people together, you put the ideas in the pot, and you say, well, because even amongst the Igbos or amongst the Yorubas, there will be somebody who will say, no, but we, in my family, we did it like this. Maybe you did it like that, but we did it like this. So it will always be a mix of different people. And what happens in many cases, sometimes co-productions don't work because co-productions depend on a very kind of commercial thing. You put in X amount, you're allowed to speak that much. So if you're giving me more, I'm going to give you more. That's the kind of thing, unfortunately. But I think in a perfect world, it would be bringing together and really cutting that slice up so that everybody feels that they're comfortable because some of what they bring is important. I read something somewhere, somebody said, it was a Twitter feed, a white South African said he recalled, and this is very interesting because I don't think white people generally just talk about the apartheid era in which they were probably responsible for some activity. So he's now an older person, maybe in his 40s, and he's talking about when he was a young child, what his father did in a situation that embarrassed him in the way that the father treated a fellow Black South African. And he put it out there. And then I read the whole thread because everybody was saying something. And for example, somebody said, I walked with my grandmother who was so old and tired, but she couldn't sit on the bench because, in South Africa, the bench said whites only on the bench, at the park, at the railway station. So he said, he remembers grandmother being bent over and tired, but she couldn't sit, and him saying, but sit on the bench. And the grandmother says, are you crazy? I'll end up in jail. So simple, shocking things like that happen. Now, how much of that do you share as the other person? And how much of that with this person, who comes together in that amalgamation, how much do you share? Because sometimes we protect even what is not needed to be protected. So when we talk about our cultures, and you rightly say in the Nollywood storytelling mold, and it's the same in South Africa, because in South Africa we have either we are telling the political story or we are telling the crazy story that mainly white South Africans are telling because they don't want to deal necessarily with the political story. In your case, it's all the cultural mix. I mean, Nigeria is such a rich heritage of over 200 million with such diversity. How do you then choose as Nollywood that this is what I'm telling? But I think I want to sell my story. So I think I have to drop in some, Western stuff from the US or the UK, or my cousin who lived in London and now has this idea. So to find that balance is really hard. And I think it takes a lot of time and energy and intelligence insofar as we are able to give and take. You giving, I'm taking, I'm giving, you taking. And we then working out that, oh, wow, this sounds interesting. But then it becomes more an experiment, an educational academic thing. It loses then the entertainment value. It loses the other aspects of storytelling because you're now trying to fit in everybody and please everybody. And that can also be a problem. So, maybe for me, it's with age that I'm less prone, I suppose, in a way, to conflict in that way. Less prone to have this huge bang, because you're kind of saying, well, it's their story, that's how they want to tell it, it's okay, but you can deconstruct it. You can have a conversation about it. You can have a dialogue. You can critique it. You can write about it. And you can say what not to do. There's a film right now that you probably saw, The Gravedigger's Wife. That was the big story at Cannes last year, and everybody was raving about it. And it's a story of, I think it's either Somalia or Sudan. I think it's Somalia. It's a young person who left his home, lives now in Finland, wrote a script based loosely on his memories of home and how, you know, things were. But the story is about grave diggers. These people basically sit outside a hospital waiting for somebody to die so that they can go and dig the grave. And by digging the grave, they will earn some money. And the couple, the story is kind of a love story, the grave digger and his wife. The wife becomes quite sick, and he now, the grave digger, wants to go back to his rural village to reclaim his inheritance, which was the cattle. He ran away with this. It was a love interest. They ran away. They left the rural village to the city, got married, carried on with their lives. But the richness, which was interesting, the richness, their material wealth was in the cattle that was in the rural village. So he now wants to go back to get his cattle. He wants, but the village and the family are like, no, you left. This is not yours. You must, you know, this is you can't come and take your brother's cattle. You left it. And we reshared it. But the reason I bring it up is that as he transitions, he's walking from the city back home. And in this, I mean, it must have been days of walking. His shirt never got dirty. There was never sweat on his brow. He was like the character, the actor was perfectly clean throughout the journey. Now, for me as a storyteller, I'm saying, but that doesn't reflect the reality. And then, as soon as he leaves the city, he's wearing, you know, the flip-flops that most African people wear, the sandals, the flip-flop sandals. He breaks. And you know that is on every corner in anywhere you will find flip-flops. You go to a mosque and they're all outside, you know, you'll just take a pair if you needed it. Anyway, he's walking and he loses the one shoe, the one sandal. So he ends up at somebody's doorway, he knocks on the door and he says, please, I need a sandal. And the woman gives him a woman's red high heel sandal. And so I was saying, it's funny. It's funny for a Western eye to see this African man who wears flip-flops, one flip-flop and one Western high heel sandal. But it's not real. You're not going to put on somebody's red sandal, walk into your village that's miles away. So, you know, what I'm trying to say with that is, how do we then as African storytellers say, no, this is not my culture. This will never happen. But you're inundated because you're sitting in Finland with all these mentors and money and whatever. And they're going, no, but this will make a funny aspect to the story. And we guarantee you that people will laugh and we will put enough marketing budget to make Cannes Festival your spot, you know, and that's what happened. And, you know, everybody was talking, it was a big deal. But when we watched it at the Luxor Film Festival, we were all as Africans saying, but how did they overlook all these steps? So what do we do? How do we find the balance? How do we say to whoever it might be, Netflix, you know, because they have commissioning editors. They're trying to sell a slot. They know who their audience is. They know what people want. They know how people look at us as Africans. And when they see you in that box, that's the box they want. You know, the Zambian former Kenneth Kaunda, the Zambian president's son, once said to me, when we were filming a big series on HIV and AIDS, and they were huge, the roads were really bad, and, you know, really like craters in the road, it was so bad. And he said, you know, when white people come here, they tell us not to fix the road because they want to feel like they are in Africa. I leave that with you. I mean, that is so layered.
That's serious. That is really serious. Wow, it's such a rich conversation with you, ma'am. We're getting to the close of this conversation so I don't waste your time. But one thing that, let me put it this way. There's a term in cultural theory called Sankofa. Sankofa is an Akan word which says, go back to your roots, which is what you've emphasized. It says, yeah, that's right. Yeah, so that's right. So in doing Sankofa, what would you want Africans, Nigerians, South Africans to do in terms of Sankofa? I mean, you've said it all, but I want you to couch it in some kind of advisory for all of us. And in doing that, I'm going to ask you a twin question. What footprints are you leaving in Nigeria, whether in collaboration with Nollywood, whether in collaboration with writers, as you come and go every other year in Nigeria? So, two questions. What advisory in terms of Sankofa would you give to our people? And what are your imprints or footprints so far in Nollywood before we close this interview? Thank you.
Thank you. As I just showed you my Sankofa bird, it's reaching back, moving forward. Mm-hmm. What do we take from the past and what do we take into the future? And I think what we take, for me personally, I take from the past the politics, the activism, the fight for freedom, the fight for a new South Africa. What do I take forward is to say to the current leadership that is corrupt, that is stealing, that is taking, that has lost the vision of what we were talking about for a new South Africa. I take that forward to say, think about where we came from and what our dreams, what our hopes, what our future we wanted for the new generation of Africans. If we put the same scenario in a creative context, in a storytelling, in whether we're making films or theater or any creative work, it's the same thing. It's the tradition, it's the culture, it's the ancestry, it's the storytelling of the past that was rich, that was vibrant, that was amazing. You know it more than I do because you know the culture of the masks, for example, the dances in Africa, in Nigeria. It is that richness that you can take into the future. And maybe you fuse it with something that is new, with something that is different, with something that is enlightening, because it is that mixture, that kind of coming together that brings out something that is more special. And I think we have a great opportunity to do that. Even if you consider the history of Nollywood, or you consider filmmaking in Egypt or in South Africa, which has a very long tradition of a very far bygone time. In South Africa, for example, feature films were made many right in the 1800s because they documented what they were doing as colonialists. And then white South Africans started to tell African stories that was the stories of Black South Africans. Whether they wanted us to be singing and dancing and looking in a particular way, that was documented, which as Africans we didn't document. And somehow, as African storytellers, we almost copied some of that. If you have time, is to research Gibson Kente, for example, in the way that is a South African theater producer, in the way that he told stories, very much like in Bongeni Ngema. When you think of Serafina, you would know Serafina, just the way in which those stories were told. But how did we modernize it? How did we make it present day? I would like to think that we can continue our partnerships between South Africa and Nigeria. We, as you know, Faith and I, me being South African, him being Nigerian, have always seen this as an important connection. We partnered with MITV, where we started a children's channel, we called it ABC, Africa's Best Channel, because we really wanted to spotlight content for young Africans, and that we wanted them to produce their own stories as well. Because what young people have learned is it's not so much in just writing the story, it is in the editing. Who edits you in or out? Who tells your story? How do you edit that story? And I think when filmmakers and storytellers start to take it seriously and study the craft, because unfortunately, many people don't study, they don't learn, they don't find out. They come and they're like, I'm a filmmaker, I'm a writer, I'm a producer, and they've learned it from one film to the other. So the real nuance, the real focus, the foundation is not there. So they haven't read the people you're talking about. They haven't learned the basics. And so they just, it's just plastering on top of something else. It will fester and the wound will eventually just, the muck, the pus will pour out. It's how do we clean it out to make sure that those storytellers have the tools. We always say just because you have a pen doesn't mean you're a writer. Just because you have a camera doesn't mean you're a cinematographer. So the tools are important. And I like to say that to young people, if this is something you want to do, it has to be your vocation. It has to be your life's work. It has to be your passion, that when you walk into that space, you light up because that's what you want to do. If I'm a theater person more than a film person. When I walk into a theater space, I get goosebumps. I feel it even today. You want to be able to do something that gives you that energy, that makes you feel that excited. Did I answer the last question?
You don't need it away. But let me also add some advisory to Nollywood. I often say, if you're looking for characters to feel your players in, to make them live, there are the character of the tortoise can be a modern man. The character of the lion can be a modern man. The character called Awolowo in history can be a modern 21st century man. Azikiwe Mandela can be a modern man. We don't always have to tell it literally that this is Mandela. So that's one problem. Like you said, we don't examine, we don't mix, we don't talk about it before we even want to do it. So that's my own advisory. It's been so good to talk to you, ma'am. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you eventually agreed to be on this interview. So I've been talking to Chairperson at Children and Broadcasting Foundation for Africa, CBFA, Managing Director at Moments Entertainment, South African activist, creative artist, producer, director, educator, mediator, trainer, storyteller, writer, and mother, and most of all, prisoner of conscience.
I was waiting for that one.
It was Bulbilia. Thank you, ma'am. I'm so happy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Lovely conversation.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.